Welcome to the podcast Quack and Road. My name is Quack Pui Lan. I would like to welcome our guest today, Najeeba Syeed. She is a public intellectual and activist. Thank you for joining me today. I know that your neighborhood in California was devastated by the wildfires. You have worked with interfaith leaders, helping to provide support and healing for the families. Can you tell us something about what you have done?
For those who don't know, the wildfires here hit two major communities. One of them is the Palisades, and the Palisades is on the closer to the ocean, and then in the mountains, the wildfires hit a community called Altadena with hundreds of structures, businesses, communities, family homes that were devastated. Along Lake Avenue, in Altadena is the second largest concentration of African American owned homes and businesses in Los Angeles County, a county of more than 10 million people, bigger than many of the states in the country. For our experience as a Muslim family, the mosque in this neighborhood was called Taqwa, Masjid Taqwa. We're now in the month of Ramadan. This is the mosque where I would go break my fast with my children. Historically African American led mosque, and Altadena and Pasadena are very intertwined communities. So the family that founded that mosque, their grandchild went to school with my son, and they were actually a Mandarin immersion program together. And so the devastation of the loss of this economic stronghold of generational wealth that was built because so many other parts of Southern California historically, because of redlining and other racist practices, didn't allow for African American home ownership and other forms of businesses to develop. So the devastation is immense. And in addition to that, we saw, for instance, the synagogue or the Jewish Community Center was lost. A Buddhist center was burned. It didn't go to the ground, but neighbors helped to save it. Several churches of many different denominations were also lost. So we have a community that lost its homes, its houses of worship. And part of the interfaith aspect of this was that there were religious communities of every background that were impacted.
As a scholar and activist, you have worked with many different people from different religious traditions. What are the challenges of doing such kind of work as a Muslim women leader?
Well, I think one of the challenges, and I think this is something that you've really modeled for me in your own work, has been not only am I a Muslim woman, but I'm also an immigrant woman. I became a citizen at the age of 15. I migrated from Kashmir. I'm South Asian. I'm Asian American. I'm visibly Muslim. I wear hijab. So I'm not just a Muslim woman. I'm a Muslim woman that comes with the experiences. We think about lived religion, lived experience of being visibly Muslim. And one of the things that I talk about in my work is Muslim women, because some of us choose to be visibly Muslim. Although we may all be Muslim, we don't all appear or dress the same way. When I walk into a room, I can't pass for anything else but my religious background. I can't walk in and be some other religious background. And some of the challenges are really, some of them are very stark. Over the years of my public scholarship and speaking in universities, I've experienced death threats. About a year and a half ago, I was supposed to speak at a major public university. I was sitting there with the religion faculty, meeting with students, ready to take the stage in a couple of hours, and they received a violent threat, according to the campus safety, based on the fact that probably all over campus they had my picture with hijab. And I had a similar situation a decade before where I was going to speak on a campus, and it was at a graduation. The ironic thing is I'm always talking about peace building. It's fascinating to me that the response to having a Muslim woman who's visibly Muslim, with her name, with her appearance, with her scholarship, and sometimes people don't even take the time to Google me. It's just that picture. And the flyer may say talking about peace building. So I think one of the difficulties is really at times, as we live in a moment where unfortunately political violence is real, and it has been the case in this country. I hope that we don't live in a moment where that increases, but that is a form of silencing. And I do think that's a very stark and real challenge. And I just wanted to put that out there in a very real way, that there are risks for us when we do this work, even if what we're talking about is a beautiful concept: peace building, getting together, supporting each other. So I have had real situations where it's not just been an email or a direct message on social media, but it's been a very clear security risk. And I know that others have probably faced even far more than I have.
I know that you have been trained as a lawyer. When did you decide that doing this activism and peace building would be your vocation?
Well, I had an interesting road to being a lawyer. I started my PhD right out of college. I studied psychology and women's studies as an undergrad. I was very clear when I went to university at the age of 17, having come from a part of the world where the border between India and Pakistan is one of the most militarized zones in the world. We have along that border, close to where I was born, one of the highest military to civilian ratios in the world. And it was very clear to me that I wanted to always ensure that my work and my faith, my religious upbringing, my religious heritage, my spiritual moral compass was to do and engage and think about peace building. So I always tell people I'm a peace builder because I'm Muslim, not despite being Muslim. So for me, my engagement in religion, peace, and justice were very much embedded in knowing the story of Bayard Rustin, one of the great organizers, community organizers. He wasn't always upfront in Dr. King's team of leaders. And I was really fascinated by how he was able to do his work, and read about him as a young person, and then was really drawn to the Quaker tradition. While deeply engaged and deeply embedded in the Muslim world, my parents were both leaders that helped start many Muslim organizations in the immigrant community. There was something about wanting to choose a college that was Quaker in its heritage, where I could learn about nonviolence, and particularly nonviolent action related to justice. And so I chose a Quaker college at 17 for that reason. And that's been a journey that stayed with me, to think about also, obviously, being South Asian, the work of Gandhiji, the work of many Muslim peacemakers in South Asia that were never told, like Badshah Khan and many other people. For me, there's a lineage of peace building and spirituality that come from my own cultural, religious heritage. And part of it was I didn't see it reflected in the literature that I had been exposed to. And it's become a lifelong pursuit of scholarship. And I would say one of the things that really influenced me was also being a woman, and that in so many conflicts that I would read, it would be women who lost their children, that crossed the borders that separate human beings. And whether it's here in Southern California, I did gang intervention for many, many years between different neighborhoods, or whether it was being called to go to places like Guam or other parts of the world where conflict emerged and they were looking for someone to do conflict intervention and mediation. It's really been women that have often done what we call, or what Elise Boulding says, is build cultures of peace. But guess what? Women utilizing their informal spiritual power, because many times they don't have spiritual authority, building cultures of peace, are often the ones that were left off at the negotiation table. Whether that table was in Southern California or whether that table was in another part of the world, we are still, unfortunately, very marginalized when it comes to formal peace processes.
You have been talking about doing public scholarship. Can you describe how you do it, and what are the barriers of women considering doing public scholarship?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm also a mother, so I entered the academy after many years of leading conflict resolution NGOs. About 10 years after graduate school, that was what I did. And then I joined a school of theology and then am now at Augsburg University, a Lutheran institution. I think some of the barriers are that very often I find, and this is what I coach my own students in, my graduate students, is sometimes as women, we feel like we have to wait till we're experts. We have to wait till someone gives us the authority to speak. We want to make sure we know everything about a topic before we share something publicly. What I've really thought through with that kind of hesitation or that waiting to speak, that waiting for permission to speak, is that it can silence us. And in fact, it may be a self-silencing. So I wanted to encourage everyone who's listening to think about when you're in the classroom, who speaks up first? Who talks? Do they always know everything? Maybe they didn't even do the reading. I'm not encouraging you if you're a student not to do the reading. What I'm saying is that I think spiritually we need to be able to understand that humility is a very important spiritual concept, that one shouldn't lead with ego. Thinking about Ella Baker's example of people who are strong don't need strong leaders. And I think that's one of the contributions that women have in public scholarship is the conversation is not leading with, and not all women, clearly, there are many variations of how we operate. The reason that I do public scholarship is not necessarily to get the voice of Najeeba out there, to get my image out there, but it's thinking about what are the experiences that I have had that are not in the public discourse. So I talk about this in my work, that we are embodied interruptions when we just walk into a space, whether for me it was also being one of the first, for instance, Muslim women who was a chief of staff to the first Asian American woman in Southern California in this Los Angeles City Council, just me walking into a secular governmental space with fully who I am is an embodied interruption. So I'll often tell people is if you're already going to be controversial just by being there, you might as well share that story, because it's a story of resilience and it's a story of not just being the first, but it's a story of how did I come to this place? What was the support that I needed? And how is this place, wherever I am, whether it's a religious space, whether it's a university space, how is it forever altered because I'm physically here?
Given that the United States is so polarized, why is interfaith learning and solidarity important for our time?
So I think one of the reasons that interfaith learning, interfaith solidarity, interfaith action, I'm just putting out there that interfaith has many iterations. Very often the approach to interfaith engagement has been very scholarly and very dialogic, putting those that have a clergy status into the leadership to do what we would say the genealogy of comparative theology of texts, where you get together and people are engaging in textual and scriptural comparison, which is a beautiful action, a beautiful way of learning. What it can do is often those that don't have spiritual authority or formal power in their religious communities may not be at the table, or it can over-textualize the conversation. What if one is from a spiritual or religious tradition? When I was at Claremont School of Theology, I had an Indigenous student, Cameron, and she would tell me, Professor Syeed, you're sitting here with all these books that you're teaching us. I want to let you know within my Native community, the text that's most important are the stories of our elders. So she gave me a book to read, which was a non-academic book, and it was a story of an elder from the community from whom she had learned. One of the things we need to do is, interfaith engagement is also a returning to the richness of what religion looks like. Whether it's lived religion, thinking of Albanese's work, or whether it's these non-traditional leaders that may not get that professorship, but have so much to offer around spirituality. And to me, that's the most exciting thing about interfaith engagement, is it gives us a wisdom that is learned through practical experience and shared in real time, in real life. I would say that some of the most important ways that whether I, as an activist or as a community leader or as a professor, have been informed is by learning stories of people who have faced or been in situations that have so much where they've had to deal with adversaries. There's a beautiful quote by James Baldwin, which I will just kind of summarize, is what he says is that, you think you've dealt with the worst of situations, the worst of times, it's only happened to you. And then his final part of the quote is, and then you read. So one of the things that gives me really solace, and what he means by then you read, is then you understand that you are not unique in your suffering, that you are not the only one who's suffered. And it also teaches you that the tools that were put together for oppression in one time go through another iteration, they find a different way, but they often look the same. History does repeat itself. And so if I, as someone who's looking for building a society where peace and justice are allowing everyone to flourish or encouraging everyone to flourish, then it's incumbent on me to learn the stories of people who came before me. And I think one of the great examples of that for a lot of immigrant Muslims is to reflect and understand and know the stories and genealogies, for instance, of Black Muslims, who scholars say up to 1/3, if not more, of people who are brought to the United States, particularly from West Africa as enslaved people, were Muslims. So those stories of resilience, those stories of understanding how faith got people through incredibly difficult scenarios and situations, those are part of the American Muslim story. They're part of the American story. And I think it's not coincidental that those stories are being suppressed right now. Because if you learn how people before you dealt with realities of limitation on freedoms, then that is pretty useful information to know for generations to come after that.
What I admire you most is you do interreligious learning and engagement in a very embodied way, and not just abstract language or academic theory. You talk about the intersectional approach to interreligious engagement. You just talk about Black Muslim women, the gender, religion, and the personal identity all intersect. Can you say a little bit more why we should not just focus on religious difference when we do this interreligious learning or engagement?
I think it's important because it's not just around the issue of identity, but our sources of resilience can also be ancestral for some communities. With my students, when they say, well, Professor Syeed, I want to put together a dialogue, I'm going to have Muslim, Christians, Jewish, Buddhist, Native communities, I'll say, which Muslim, which Christian? So if you and I are in this conversation as Puelan, what is your history with Christianity? One of the things that we did in our book, Critical Approaches to Interreligious Education, was, for me, it was really important to have voices like Monica Coleman. She's also a good friend, but to get her to share the contribution teaching African American religious pluralism, because one of the things that her offerings were, for instance, the origin of African American religion in this continent is inherently religiously plural. That interrogates the notion that ideas or theologies of religious pluralism, of diversity, are something that were developed in the last 25 years in the academy and certain programs. What she's able to offer us is to say, actually, African American religious history in the United States is by its very nature religiously plural, that there were multiple religious communities that existed, that became sources of strength. And as I mentioned, for instance, ancestral wisdoms, thinking about how many communities have some hybridity. My students who are of Latina background, very often will share indigenous practices along their Christian identity. I teach at a university that has a very large Hmong population. Traditional Hmong rituals coexist with some of the very Christian practices and belief systems. We have to also see that part of our identities, particularly those through processes, whether it's colonization or other, that are diminished, One of the ways that religion functions as a construct to destabilize our commitments to different forms of our spiritual lineages and heritages is to say, well, one part of it is legitimate because it's religious in the way that we think religion looks like. It follows a text, it follows a prescribed practice, it has some kind of permission. So I think when we engage the very rich parts of people's stories and we give time and we listen, then there's something that I learned from you in this conversation today. How have you navigated your world of the United States that you've migrated to? And what are the stories that you bring with you? Christine Hong's article in the book that I edited, Critical Perspectives on Interreligious Education, and then also the book that you edited on, that I contributed to on Asian American women's theology, we began to understand that people can also have religious and spiritual identities, as Hong says, that are transnational. And these trans-spiritual, transnational identities bring so much richness into them. And I recently opened up a forum. We were talking about interfaith work, a forum put together by local Jewish and Christian congregations on migration and immigration in this moment. How do congregations manage those? And I kind of changed my script. I didn't do a lecture. I opened it up with poems. I have a book of poetry coming out called Dreaming Lost Bodies Back. It'll hopefully be out in about 6 months. One of the things that I'm finding is even traditional academic language isn't the space where I find the ability to imagine a world outside of a place where we have made borders our religion. That's one of the poems where instead of a spiritual, humanistic approach to relationships with one another, we've taken borders, whether those borders are literal borders, whether those borders are between our religions, whether the borders are between people who are wealthy and people who do not have access to wealth. We've made these borders, instead of flowing water where we can contribute to one another, I think we live in a time where we've made them literally barbed wire to separate us.
Your book also talks about empathy. Why is cultivating empathy such an important thing for us today?
The heart of empathy, there are two aspects to it. From the perspective of social sciences, Carol Winner and Moskowitz and other scholars say that empathy means that you can see someone's story from their perspective, or you can take an issue and you can see it from your perspective, and you can sit for a moment in the shoes of another and see an issue from theirs. You know, a lot of activists are not able to do that. So at the very basic strategic level, we have to be able to see an issue from multiple perspectives, because one of the jobs of an activist is to be able to convince people that what they're working for is worthwhile for others to engage in. So I think that's a very, very basic strategic and kind of perspective taking, as we talk about it, important factor in when we're trying to build justice in the world. The other piece is, with the Muslim tradition, we have this notion of karama, dignity, the Arabic word, and the Quran, our sacred text, tells us that every human being who comes into the earth brings with them karama, dignity. And this dignity is not rendered by human beings. This dignity is not given by the state. This dignity is not given by another human being. It's not given to you by a spiritual leader. It's given to you by God. So for me, empathy means I am listening to you, not just to understand your perspective. That's very important. Active listening, thinking about that. Even more deeply, I'm listening so that I can make sure that I am recognizing your karama, your humanity. Because if I don't have empathy for your story, I am denying you your dignity. And so to me, engaging, having the Quran also tells us that God made human beings diverse. God made human beings of different languages, of different backgrounds, and that our challenge as human beings with this diversity of creation, of language, religion, ethnicity, race, as it may be, the challenge for human beings is to ta'arafu, which from Arabic means to know one another. So when I am listening to your story, it's me saying, I honor you as a human being. I want to honor your dignity, and my challenge is to get to know you. That is the sacred struggle for us on this earth, is not just to listen to one another, not just to hear one another, but to completely accept the humanity of one another. Because what we do when we have empathy is that translates into action. If I'm listening to you and your story and your struggles and your challenges, and I am holding those close to my heart, that boundary, that border, that separation evaporates, and your story becomes as important as mine. Your dignity and fulfilling your dignity becomes part of my sacred obligation. If you have your dignity violated, then that is a sacred trust between us that I have violated as well. So really that restorative justice, that restorative approach to human relationships. Because I think if we live in a constant state of retribution, revenge, and valorizing vindication of strength over love and empathy, ultimately the world will be destroyed. And we as human beings will destroy one another, but we'll also destroy the natural world that is our planetary home.
That is so well said. You are a professor of interfaith studies and executive director of the Interfaith Institute at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. Can you tell us something what that institute does?
So one of the beautiful things about Augsburg is we are located in the largest Somali Muslim population outside of Mogadishu. And I emphasize that because that means we have become an anchor institution in a community that is very religiously diverse. We also are in a neighborhood that is close to one of the largest urban native populations in the country as well, in Minneapolis. And so our interfaith work is guided by the notion of our institution being an anchor in this neighborhood. So we're very what we call place-based in our ethical approach to interfaith engagement. So what that means is while I'm running around the country speaking, doing national engagement, we are also very much in touch and in tune with our neighbors that are working on the opioid crisis in our community. 2 years in a row, we supported our neighbors working on the opioid crisis to hold a Somali youth conference. You know, one of my favorite interfaith dialogues, I teach a class called Interfaith Scholars of people of every different religious traditions. We take our students into the community to learn about recovery, to engage with programs that work on homelessness of our neighbors with unhoused neighbors. One of my favorite dialogues was between a Jewish student who engaged in a conversation with an imam, a Muslim leader who was on a panel, and they were talking about recovery from addiction. And they were both saying, you know, we wish there were more models of recovery, 12-step programs that were inclusive of Judaism and Islam, because so many of the models are very Christian-centric, and I can't take those into my community. So I think that's a really powerful dialogue to be having. And I'm not sure that that's happening everywhere, but to me, that was really indicative of what we're doing on a regular basis, is thinking about how do we engage. One of the parts of our mission at Augsburg University is to help our students become thoughtful stewards. So we are certainly grounded in the Lutheran tradition and Lutheran sense of hospitality and have become vibrant. We are now, I think, considered, according to the US News and World Report, the most regionally diverse, ethnically diverse campus in the Midwest. So our incoming class was more than, I think, 70 to 80% BIPOC, people of color. And what that means is we have to be intentional in our pluralism. We can't just walk into the cafeteria and everyone's sitting with their community. We have to create conversations and opportunities, and there's no better way to engage in those conversations than to take a real life community challenge and say, what are the assets that we bring to the table? What do our religions and spiritual and ethnic and other identities, how do we mesh those in a way that we keep their unique gifts at the table and work together on real life issues? So I'm excited for when religion becomes part of the solution and not as is often considered just a part of the problem. And that is happening all over our country. And that's why I'm glad we're sharing those stories.
Congratulations on the work well done. You have been traveling and then giving lecture and leading workshops all over the country. How do you replenish your energy?
I think things that have really been helpful for me have been being in nature. And I think this started during the pandemic. It's been my whole life that I have always been very much someone connected to nature. In the Muslim tradition, when we learn about, for instance, the story of Ibrahim or Abraham, Prophet Abraham, he was someone that was told to look at the patterns of the moon, the patterns of the sun. What do you learn? The Quran is full of examples of, I don't know if we're one of the few scriptures that have chapters that are written, chapters that are named after like the bee. We're meant to ponder the bees, ponder the ants. These are all characters in the Quran. They're all fully animated actors. And for me, when I was younger, I took those stories to heart. They were beautiful stories. And now I really understand why so many ascetics and mystics of all of our religious traditions. I remember when traveling in Turkey, looking at the caves of monks and monasteries up so isolated. Prophet Muhammad received his first revelation of the Quran, the first verse of it, in a cave up in the mountains. He withdrew from human beings and was really, if we think about it, in this womb of nature. And for me, that has been so important for healing. So one of the things that I do when I travel is I try to pack comfortable shoes in addition to whatever shoes I'm giving my workshop in. And I just walk. And I just, in addition to, the prayers that I make within my religious tradition, thinking about the practice of walking as meditation and not on a treadmill, not in front of the TV, but walking outside. And whether it's along the Mississippi River in Minneapolis, or whether it's in the mountains of Southern California, or whether it's in a little green park across the street from the hotel by the airport in some city that I'm staying, that sense of wonder and awe. And I would say one of the things that I've really learned is to appreciate the insignificance that nature teaches me. And I think that's a divine lesson, that when you are outside, when you see the majesty of creation out there, you realize that you're one piece of it. And the Quran talks about this idea of mizan, of creation as balance, and that there's a balance so that every part of creation has its role. And that what happens, guess what? Everyone else is doing their role really well. The Quran talks about the trees are doing their role, the mountains are doing their role, but guess who transgresses? Human beings, because we have free will. So to me, one of the ways that I am in nature is to remember that there is something bigger than me, that there is a system that is larger than me. I am significant, but I am also insignificant. And that insignificance is a lesson in my humility. And in some ways, that allows me to dispense with the fact that the whole world is on my shoulders and that I will be the one that figures everything out. It keeps me from having a savior complex. So on the days when my head is getting too big and I think, if only I had done that, I would have changed the meeting, I can say, you know what? I did my best. And there is a lot happening in the world, and I can only ethically practice what I can do within the limitations of my human existence. And the rest is up to God.
Thank you so much for sharing your rich wisdom with us today. If you like this episode, please click like and subscribe. Thank you.